For the 9 years since marrying Daniel, I had been treated coldly by both Jessica and my stepdaughter, Emma, like a housekeeper. The only thing that kept me going was the kind words and gratitude of George, Daniel's father, who I was caring for. However, as soon as he passed away after a long illness, they told me,
"You're no longer needed here. Leave the house immediately."
I already have someone else. Crying and begging won't help.
With that, Daniel handed me the divorce papers. Understood. I'll leave once the funeral arrangements for George are complete. I felt a surge of anger so intense it made me tremble, but I held it back at that moment. On the morning of the funeral, I left my in-laws' house. However, starting the next day, I began receiving frantic calls from Daniel and Jessica. My name is Lauren. I'm 33 years old. I was a stay-at-home mom living with Daniel, my husband who is 12 years my senior, his parents, and his daughter, Emma. Before our marriage, I worked as an occupational therapist, supporting people with illnesses or injuries. But when I married Daniel, he said,
I understand that you find your current job fulfilling, but I need you to stay home for Emma's sake.
This was my first marriage, but it was Daniel's second. He was raising Emma, his daughter from his previous marriage. Due to his demanding job as a doctor, he couldn't manage being a single father alone, so we lived with his parents.
When I divorced my first wife, Emma was only 5. Although my parents and I have done our best to take care of her, I feel that Emma has always wanted a mother.
When Daniel confided in me, he asked me a favor with Emma in mind.
Perhaps this is a lot to ask, relying on you just because we're married. But I would really want to provide Emma with a kind of home where her mother would welcome her back home every day. What do you think?
Daniel asked me with concern, but I agreed without hesitation. This was partly because my father had fallen ill when I was in elementary school, leaving him with a severe disability. So my mother was always busy taking care of my father, who needed constant care, and my paternal grandparents, who lived with us, so she had almost no time for me, her only daughter. Of course, I don't blame my mother for that. But the fact is, there were many times when I couldn't help but cry because I had to prepare for field trips, sports events, and shopping for school trips all by myself. That's why when Daniel proposed the idea of moving in together, I thought of his daughter, Emma, and I agreed without hesitation. So, I started living with my in-laws right after getting married. George, Daniel's father, was a retired doctor, and Jessica, Daniel's mother, was a housewife like me. They asked me to take over all the household chores previously handled by their housekeeper. Of course, I had no complaints about doing housework as a housewife.
What a disappointing daughter-in-law. The previous one had good education and looked good, but this one has nothing going for her except being young.
Jessica often belittled me. According to Daniel, his ex-wife, Emma's biological mother, was a doctor who graduated from the same university as Daniel and was reputed to be beautiful. But she was 3 years older than Daniel and often clashed with Jessica's condescending attitude, which led to their separation and eventual divorce soon after Emma was born. I was told that Emma was taken in by Daniel because his ex-wife couldn't handle being a single mother and gave up custody in exchange for child support. I understand that compared to his ex-wife, who graduated with top grades from a famous medical school, my degree from a private university might seem inferior. I also know from seeing photos in Emma's room that his ex-wife was a glamorous beauty, unlike me. I know I'm not much. But when Jessica said,
Well, I guess it can't be helped. Finding a girl who'd work for us without complaining, just as long as we give her some food, is not easy.
I was speechless. I had no relatives to rely on. My father, who had been ill for a long time, passed away when I was in 8th grade. Shortly after, my paternal grandparents, who lived with us, also passed away. My mother, who had been overworking herself for years, died after a brief illness when I was in 10th grade. After my mother's death, I temporarily stayed with my maternal uncle. But when I realized their interest was in the small insurance money my mother left, I fled to a distant college. Since then, I have cut off all contact with my relatives. I revealed all of this to Daniel shortly after we started dating.
Jessica, you're amazing. You've managed to keep yourself together and work hard through all of this. I respect you as a woman and as a person.
It was those words that made me decide to marry Daniel, despite the objections from friends, colleagues, and seniors who were wary of marrying a divorced man with a child. So, when Jessica basically referred to me as a free housekeeper, I was deeply shocked. When I hesitantly told Daniel about it late that night, I expected him to scold Jessica or at least comfort me. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. Daniel, who came home happily drunk, turned red with anger as he listened to me. He threw his suit jacket at me and yelled.
Who do you think you are?
I stood there, stunned.
You think you can talk crap about my mother? I married you because I wanted a wife who could work for free without complaints, just as my mother said.
Then, perhaps fueled by the alcohol, he started talking more than usual. Apparently, until I was about to start working at Daniel's hospital, they had always hired a live-in housekeeper. But the cost was very high, considering the salary, the room, and the bathroom for the housekeeper, plus supplies. Even though Daniel and George earned high salaries, it was quite a burden. However, Jessica, who was raised like a princess as the daughter of a university professor and never did housework since her first marriage failed, didn't change her ways. After remarrying George, her parents paid for a housekeeper to take care of all the household chores. But when Jessica's parents passed away, the situation changed dramatically. Her brother and his wife refused to help Jessica financially. So, George and Daniel had to bear the cost of the housekeeper themselves. However, due to Jessica's long-standing extravagance on spas, overseas trips, theater, and shopping, the family finances were apparently quite strained. To make matters worse, George suffered a stroke, the same illness that had struck my own father. Though his prognosis was relatively good, he needed assistance with most daily activities, like eating and bathing. Not surprisingly, Jessica refused to take care of him. Yet, when it came to placing him in a facility, both Jessica and Daniel were very reluctant.
That's too expensive. Isn't there a cheaper way?
They started to think of alternate solutions. At that moment, Daniel heard rumors about me starting a new job as an occupational therapist at a hospital. When I started, I had no close family to act as my guarantors, so my professors from my university stood in. The hospital administration, upon learning this, thought it unusual but assumed I must be exceptionally competent to graduate at the top of my class. They were optimistic about what I could bring. However, when he heard of this, Daniel thought of me as being a labor force they could be exploited without the fear of me leaving.
That's why I got close to you and pushed for marriage. Who else would marry you? Just look in the mirror.
He confessed, laughing hysterically as he left the bedroom. I could only watch him leave in stunned silence. With me not having anywhere to escape to, Daniel and Jessica stopped pretending to be civil the very next day. They even dismissed the private carer hired for George, making me responsible for all household chores while also caring for him. Despite his frailty, George protested, though neither Daniel nor Jessica listened.
What an outrageous thing to do. Are you planning to make Lauren do the housework and take care of me, too?
Because of this, I was busy from early morning until late at night, balancing housework and caregiving, with barely any time to sit down. Although George had some numbness in his non-dominant hand, He tried to take care of himself as much as possible to lighten my burden.
Hey, I told you to make breakfast a low-calorie, Instagram-worthy menu with plenty of fruits and vegetables. How many times do I have to tell you?
Meanwhile, Jessica tried to impose her whims even during busy mornings.
Why didn't you pick up my suit from the cleaners yesterday? I told you I needed it for today's meeting. You're completely useless.
To make matters worse, Daniel was no different from his mother. What shocked me even more was that Emma began to look down on me, emulating Daniel and her grandmother. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a child mimicking her father and grandmother. But one day, after I handed Emma the lunch I had painstakingly prepared for her field trip, she deliberately dropped it on the floor and stomped on it with her slippers, laughing. Moreover, when she tore apart the photos of my parents I had cherished, and laughed as she saw me crying while picking up the pieces, my heart broke completely. In the midst of such a life, the only solace was the presence of my considerate and thoughtful father-in-law, despite his physical limitations. For the 9 years I was married to Daniel, the only peaceful moments I had were when George's health was stable and we would go to the nearby botanical garden to admire the colorful seasonal flowers. Therefore, when George fell ill from a sudden cold and quickly passed away, the sense of loss I felt was indescribable.
You're no longer needed. Get out of this house.
Jessica said, sneering at me as I cried beside George's coffin.
I already have someone else. Crying and begging won't help.
Daniel said, thrusting a completed divorce form in front of me. I was filled with a searing anger at the thought that these people couldn't even mourn their husband and father's passing. But fighting here wouldn't honor George. All right. I'll leave after the funeral preparations are finished. On the morning of George's funeral, after praying at the altar, I left my in-laws' house. However, the next day, Daniel and Jessica started bombarding my phone with calls and messages. I ignored them for a while, but the constant calls and messages became overwhelming. Just then, I received the news I had been waiting for, so I decided to answer the next call. The call was from Jessica, who immediately started yelling at me.
You thief. What tricks did you use to win over your father-in-law?
I had anticipated this, so it didn't bother me. Daniel then grabbed the phone from his mother and started yelling just as loudly.
Hey, Lauren, what do you mean you're inheriting all of Dad's estate?
These two are truly so alike. I don't think I can have a proper conversation with people who are so heated. If you calm down, I'm willing to discuss the inheritance. I responded calmly, which made Jessica and Daniel suddenly fall silent. They probably realized that angering me would ruin their chances of getting anything. After a brief pause, Jessica, now speaking in a much friendlier tone, agreed to meet at the lawyer's office the next day. The following day, I was surprised to see Jessica, Daniel, and even Emma arriving much earlier than the scheduled time.
At 17, some people are already working. It might be the responsibility of the adults around her to make her aware of her situation.
Although I initially thought Emma shouldn't hear this, the lawyer's quick remark made me change my mind. Thus began the discussion. Jessica started shouting at me right from the start.
The letter sent from here states that all of my husband's estate is to be inherited by Lauren, leaving me, his wife, with only the legally mandated share. Isn't that absurd?
Daniel wasn't backing down either and shouted.
That's right. Lauren isn't even Dad's child. She's just my wife.
At that point, the lawyer handed over the family registers of the deceased father-in-law and me.
If you look at these, you'll see that the rightful heirs are the spouse and children. However, since the deceased had no biological children, in this case, the heirs are the adopted daughter, Lauren, and the wife.
As he said this, he spread out a diagram showing the inheritance relationships in front of the three of them. What the lawyer and I had been waiting for was this court inheritance information diagram, which could be obtained by submitting necessary documents like the family register to the Legal Affairs Bureau. Jessica and Daniel looked at the family register and the diagram in astonishment, but recovered surprisingly quickly. Then Daniel pulled out an envelope from his bag and thrust it under the lawyer's nose as if to retaliate.
Even if my wife was adopted by Dad, this will state that the estate should be inherited by my mother, me, and my daughter, Emma. I don't know how this woman manipulated things, but if you're going to back this nonsense, we'll take legal action.
The will, which he showed with a flourish, was indeed written in his father-in-law's handwriting, summarizing exactly what Daniel said. The date was only about 6 months ago, so it was understandable they mistook it for the latest will. With smug faces, his mother-in-law and Daniel were shocked when the lawyer, still calm, pulled out another will and showed it to them. This wasn't surprising, as the will shown by the lawyer was an authorized will, unlike the handwritten one Daniel had. Even if Daniel and his mother-in-law claimed it was forged or altered, it was almost impossible for such claims to be accepted. Moreover, the date on this will was just a month before his father-in-law's death, clearly later than the will Daniel presented. The lawyer reinforced the validity of the will to the now pale-faced mother-in-law and Daniel.
Daniel, you are your wife's stepson, right? Since you weren't adopted when your mother remarried, you have no legal right to inherit. Similarly, Emma is your wife's child from a previous marriage, so legally, she is also considered a non-relative.
Hearing this so plainly from the lawyer, their faces turned almost ashen, and Emma, sensing the tense atmosphere, seemed restless. As the lawyer mentioned, Daniel was a child from his mother-in-law's previous marriage and not the deceased's biological son. My father-in-law had never intended to marry my mother-in-law.
My father-in-law, that is, Jessica's father, who doted on Jessica, was my mentor from medical school. He was my superior, and I felt indebted to him. That's why I made myself marry her.
So he reluctantly went along with the marriage. Even so, because they had become family through marriage, at first, George tried to accept Jessica and Daniel.
I only married you because I didn't want Daniel to be raised by a single parent. As long as we maintain appearances, that's all that matters. So don't get too familiar with me.
Despite George's efforts, Jessica remained cold. Jessica seemed to hold an extraordinary grudge against her ex-husband who abandoned her. She had him demoted to a dead-end job with the help of her father, received a significant amount of money as alimony and property division, and made him pay a hefty child support. According to George, this was just my stepmother's way of getting back at him.
The responsibility to pay child support falls on the adopting parent first, and then the biological parent next. That's probably why Jessica didn't arrange Daniel to be adopted by me, so that it will all fall upon her previous husband.
I was just flabbergasted when he revealed this to me. This left Daniel's biological father paying hefty child support until Daniel graduated from medical school, never being able to remarry and dying in despair. Meanwhile, despite claiming it was just for appearances, Daniel's mother-in-law enjoyed a lavish lifestyle on her new husband's money.
What's wrong? Are you saying you want to end up like my previous husband, acting this way?
Even when George tried to speak to her properly, instead of reflecting on her actions, she just became more defiant. It seems the family was completely cold and dysfunctional. Daniel, much like his mother, had similar behavior issues, leading to frequent fights with his ex-wife over his infidelities and spending habits. When they divorced, Daniel fought to keep custody of Emma, despite his previous misconduct.
He probably couldn't accept the fact that he was the one who was being dumped, even when he was in the wrong. Daniel took advantage of his grandfather's influence as a professor, and threatened his ex-wife to give up custody.
Seeing this, George advised Daniel's ex-wife to agree to the divorce and temporarily give up custody of Emma.
I suggested this because, although child support payment was going to be tough, at least while she's got the payment going, she would be able to keep in contact with Emma. I also thought that after she becomes a bit older, Emma would be able to understand her mother more.
Unfortunately, this hope was never realized, and Emma grew up to be self-centered, much like her father and grandmother. She behaved rudely even when her grandfather, on his deathbed, tried to talk to her about her future.
Why'd I have to listen to a dying old man? This is such a drag.
When she spat those nasty words at me for calling out her rude behavior, then left, laughing loudly and slamming the door, I was so filled with anger and humiliation that tears welled up in my eyes. After her disrespectful behavior, my father-in-law hurriedly made preparations for after he passes away. The first thing he did was to call the lawyer to come over, so as to adopt me legally and to arrange for inter vivos gifts.
You must have known that Daniel had another woman and was planning to use the inheritance to start his own practice. He also wanted to take as much as possible for himself, leaving you with nothing.
Hearing this, I nodded at his determined yet gentle smile. Now, the lawyer informed us that George had donated a significant portion of his estate to a medical research foundation. As a result, the total inheritance was far less than they had imagined, leaving Daniel's mother-in-law with only $5,000 or so. The two who heard the lawyer's story were driven mad, but it was all brought upon themselves.
Lauren, you're a kind woman. You'll help me and Mom, right?
Daniel turned to me, trying to cling to me, but I stood up, ignoring him. The divorce papers you gave me the other day were accepted yesterday. You and I are strangers now. I only had adoption arrangements with George, so I have no obligation to listen to requests from strangers like yourself. I said coldly, and left the office, glancing at the stunned faces of Jessica and Daniel and Emma, who couldn't grasp the situation. Despite all the explanations they had received at the law firm, it seemed that Jessica and Daniel couldn't give up on the inheritance they had been counting on from George. They went around visiting various law firms, asking if there was any way their demands could be met. But naturally, at reputable firms, they were told they had no chance of winning, even if they went to court, and no one would take on such a case. However, there was one firm that approached Jessica and Daniel, who were desperately running around. The lawyer, who was the head of that firm, was a man in his 50s with a strong presence.
I've heard you've had a rough time, and other firms turned you away, didn't they? If you leave it to me, it might take a bit of effort, but I'll make sure your late husband's inheritance goes to you.
The two of them jumped at the man's words as if it were a lifeline. They transferred money one after another under the pretext of initial fees and investigation costs, just as the man instructed. However, contrary to their expectations, the man rarely contacted them, and when he finally did, it was always to demand additional fees.
If you want to terminate the contract, that's fine. But if you do, all the expenses so far will be a total loss. Is that okay?
By the time most of the money Jessica received as a legal portion of the inheritance was gone, even the two of them lost their patience and demanded to know the progress of the case. In the end, it seemed they had all their money swindled. One day, Jessica happened to pass by the building where the law firm was located for another errand. She noticed that the office on the floor visible from the street had a "For Rent" sign. She hurriedly went up to the office floor by elevator, only to find it completely empty. The sofas and file cabinets inside the office were piled up haphazardly, and a junk dealer was inspecting the items. Jessica, almost in tears, called, and Daniel came running, out of breath, but even the junk dealer knew nothing. When they inquired with the building manager, they were told that the rent had not been paid for months and they were clearing it out because the eviction deadline had passed. At a loss and desperate, Daniel and Jessica reluctantly turned to Jessica's brother, with whom they were almost estranged, for help. Jessica's brother, who was born into a family of doctors but became a banker, listened to the whole story in disbelief and consulted a lawyer he was close to. It turned out that the man they thought was a lawyer was a well-known con artist in the area. His usual method was to approach people who had been abandoned by other lawyers as having no chance of winning. And after making easy promises, they find various pretexts to extract money and eventually disappear without a trace. Although they reported it to the police just in case, despite many fraud reports, his whereabouts were still unknown. Even if he were arrested, most of the swindled money would have disappeared into the shadows, and compensation to the victims would be minimal. Jessica fainted from the shock when she heard this. Moreover, half of the money she had given to the fake lawyer was borrowed without Daniel's knowledge. It was also revealed that she had borrowed the money by making Daniel the guarantor without his consent, leading to a huge fight between them.
I had no choice. Without your father's inheritance, we wouldn't be able to clear my debt or yours.
Talking to his crying mother was useless, so Daniel himself went to the lender. However, the lender was shady and unscrupulous, and Daniel's claims that he had been made a guarantor without his consent were deftly sidestepped.
If it was without your consent, why don't you sue your mother for forgery? But what would happen to your reputation as a doctor if you did that?
This was said with a menacing smile. In the end, they had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. Of course, even if he declared bankruptcy, Daniel's medical license wouldn't be immediately revoked, but it was undeniably a severe blow to his plans to open his own clinic. Starting a clinic requires a significant amount of funding, and even if John had received George's inheritance as planned, securing a loan from a financial institution was a necessity. However, after declaring bankruptcy, his credit record would prevent him from getting any loans for an extended period. Desperate, Daniel begged the hospital he had arrogantly left to rehire him as a staff doctor, even going as far as to kneel in apology. Unsurprisingly, they refused him, and he couldn't get his old job back. Daniel's reputation took another hit when George's former students and colleagues learned about his situation, and they all turned their backs on him. As debt collectors relentlessly pursued them, Daniel's mother-in-law struggled financially. She was eventually taken in by a distant relative, arranged by her compassionate brother, to work as a janitor in their factory. Meanwhile, Daniel was forced to work at a clinic controlled by those who had a hand in his downfall.
Please help me. We were husband and wife once.
A man sounding a lot like Daniel pleaded on my voicemail from a payphone just before being taken away. I deleted it immediately, having no intention to respond. As for Emma, during the inheritance chaos, she cried and worried about what was to become of herself. Daniel, overwhelmed, contacted his ex-wife to take Emma back. Emma was briefly excited, thinking she'd live a wealthy life with her capable and beautiful biological mother, but her hopes were dashed.
Are you kidding me? Why do you think I've been paying 3 times the usual child support all this time?
Rose refused to take her in.
We agreed that child support ends when she turns 18. I'll give you the last year's payment in advance, and that's the end of it.
Rose handed Daniel an envelope from the bank and left. That money quickly vanished, spent by Daniel and his mother-in-law, leaving Emma unable to afford her school fees. She had to drop out of her private high school, which she had assumed would automatically lead to college. Somehow, Emma found my temporary apartment and tearfully begged for help.
Please, I'm sorry. Help me. Even if we weren't legally bound, we lived as mother and daughter for 9 years.
Regardless of how convenient it is for you to forget, during those 9 years, All you did was reject me and my efforts to bring us closer. We were never family and never will be." Emma was teary-eyed, but I talked to her rather flatly.
I was just a kid. How can you be so cruel not to forgive a child?
Emma turned pale and retorted, "You hurt both me and your grandfather. It doesn't matter if it was done by a child or an adult, the pain is the same. It's no excuse." I closed the door on her, sobbing. Her crying faded after an hour. Later, I heard through the grapevine that Emma was taken in by her biological grandmother, who was strict, determined to correct Emma's spoiled behavior. I hope she uses this last chance to turn her life around. Once everything settled, I fulfilled a promise I made to my father-in-law before his death. My dream is to study abroad and become a licensed occupational therapist overseas. My own father, before falling ill, worked for a major company, and I spent my early years overseas. I always wanted to follow in his footsteps and had considered studying abroad, but my parents' illnesses turned that dream into fantasy. I confided this to George while I cared for him.
Promise me you'll pursue your dreams after I'm gone.
He said, smiling. I think that's what your parents would want too. Encouraged by his words, I spent a year studying and preparing in my temporary apartment. I was finally made an offer from a university overseas. I visited my parents' grave to tell them about my departure, and also prayed for George, who became like a second father to me. Challenges will come. And there will be times I feel like giving up or cry. But I have the unwavering support of my two fathers and my mother, who cheer me on with their smiles. I'll do my best, Dad, Mom. I said, smiling, as I took my first steps toward my dream.